We're in your United States history book, chapter 25. We're going to get into World War II that happened 1939 through 1945. We're going to be talking about the road to war at this time and on to the United States moving from neutrality and into focusing on the European theater and the Pacific theater and the effects of the war. So this video mainly is going to be on the road to war. What brought us into another war? World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And just 20 years later, we're thrown into another world war. How could this be? Well, we're going to find out. The road to war timeline. I like the timeline that's in your book a little better. This one's a little blurry, but basically you can see the war beginning in 1939 to 1945. So during this time, it's intense war, and not until 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor in December, was America thrown into World War when we were attacked by Japan. So here it just goes from Germany invading Poland, beginning the war, onto the Dunkirk evacuation, which is a miracle. We'll talk about that later. Germany invading the Soviet Union, and we'll talk about that too. Onto the attack on Pearl Harbor and the fall of Bataan, the Battle of Midway, all of these in the South Pacific. The Allies invading North Africa, Italy surrendering, the Normandy invasion, D-Day, that Normandy in France, the invasion of Germany, Battle of the Bulge, Roosevelt dying during this time, and President Truman taking over and deciding the decision made to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. So this is a lot to cover. So we're going to do this in a few videos though, and try to find out what really happened during this time, during World War II. What was World War II all about? So I like what Dwight Eisenhower said. He said, "United in this determination with unshakable faith in the cause for which we fight, we will, with God's help, go forward to our greatest victory." Dwight Eisenhower, who he would become a president of one of the presidents of the United States. So him looking on and asking God for help is where I see the important thing at this time, is that the United States we were on our knees asking God for his grace and his help. So Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland started the Second World War in 1939. The United States would not enter the war until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. So that was a few years, 3 years later. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, won many early victories. Why do they call them the Axis powers? Well, because basically Hitler, who at that time was the dictator of Germany, and he wanted to rule the world. And he said the world is not going to be able to, not be able to turn on its axis without him ruling the world, and basically having the new world order and all of that. That's prophetic in the Bible, and that Germany, Italy, and Japan would be those powers that would rule the axis of the world. So what a deal. Anyway, they were defeated when the tide turned in late 1942, and Italy surrendered in 1943, in Germany in the May of 1945. So, and then we have Japan surrendered September 1945. So Italy, headed with Mussolini, surrenders in 1943, 2 years before Hitler ends up committing suicide. Germany surrenders in May of 1945, and Japan surrendering in September, a few months later in 1945. So that's just kind of basic outline of the timeline of World War II. Continued world problems after World War I. So again, World War I was the war that would end all wars. That's what it was called. We're not going to have any more wars, they said. Well, it was fought to make the world safe. However, the war created more problems than it solved. The rise of socialism and militarism caused dictatorships with ultra-nationalism. That they made basically ultra-nationalism, that they were focusing on their nation as ruling other nations. And they made a second global world war was inevitable because of the rise in socialism and on to communism, we'll find later on, and these military dictatorships. The disarmament, basically treaties of disarmament, that they would disarm each other or be disarmed, failed, of course, and international tension developed, and a lot of this international tension was actually due to widespread religious unbelief. So once a Christian Europe now was very much agnostic and atheistic in belief. And out of this would come rising dictators. Doesn't this imagine, that when you look at this whole situation, don't you look and see what may be happening in the future when we think of Armageddon and we think of the New World Order onto the revived Roman Empire and all this that we see in the Bible. So you can imagine they were probably looking like, oh, is this the end of the world at this time? But there was one thing missing at this time. Israel had not been back to the land, had not become a nation yet in 1948. After World War II, we find that Israel will become a nation. So it's all prophetic. It all works into what God's plan has for the future very soon. Now we see the end times working out, and that we still are here, as the church, and that the Lord's coming back to take us away, snatch us away at any minute. But looking back to World War II, it probably set the whole field for Israel actually coming back to its homeland. So we'll see that what happened in World War II. We know for sure that the Israel Jews were persecuted and anti-Semitism happened, and we know the concentration camps and all that happened would bring the Jews back to their homeland. So we'll get into another video with that. Disarmament failures. While the League of Nations attempted at peace in 1920 and also in 1930s, they also had attempted as disarmament in making peace. So the League of Nations attempted. They didn't get the job done, that's for certain. One attempt was at Geneva, Switzerland. 60 nations met to discuss disarmament. And so as they got together, Germany pleaded with them all to reduce their arms as set by the Treaty of Versailles, ending in World War I. So Germany's saying, you guys all need to reduce your arms. You need to reduce your military. You all need to do this right now. And then we see later on Germany attacking. So maybe that was their motive. Who knows? But basically Germany pleading with them to reduce their arms, and then France and others refusing to do this. And so at the Geneva Disarmament Conference, there was a great failure. Here it says, oh, it's going to turn out great. The Geneva conferences of the League of Nations. Basically, the League of Nations would not be able to do one thing in promoting peace. So Germany withdraws from the conference, it says here. Hitler would eventually decide to withdraw from the Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations in October of 1933. He cited unequal treatment. So here we have Hitler now leading Germany. And to add legitimacy to the decision, he called for a public plebiscite. 95% of the people would vote in favor. So basically he was saying, okay, here, we have not been treated fairly anyway, so why should we do anything? So, basically Germany withdrawing from this conference was a clear signal of Germany's intention to rearm themselves. And basically that's what they did. International tensions went on now. So, of course, Germany was in a desperate state at this time. So Adolf Hitler, took advantage of it to further his dream. What was his dream? Oh, to rule the world. He was definitely a dictator. So before this though, let's talk about these international tensions. Number one, there was the war debt. The German economy was very devastated, and this caused great bitterness. The Allies still blamed Germany for World War I, and they were demanding Germany pay reparations for the war. And so in 1923, Germany defaulted on her debt payments and basically longed for revenge, saying, how can we pay this? There's no way we can pay. We have a Great Depression going on. So the war debt caused the German people to look for a military dictator, for someone to get them out of their desperate state. And indeed, they had a depression going on. Number two, the competition for colonies, resources, and markets. Both Italy and Japan faced heavy debts too and economic hardships. And they thought themselves deprived of colonies and raw materials. So Germany, Italy, and Japan sought lands. They wanted more lands to give them more resources so they could broaden their markets. And indeed, that's what they, especially in Japan being just an island, wanted to be able to control the Asian market, which included China and onto Indonesia. So, and we see Germany and Europe and Italy, of course, they're going to be going all the way into Africa. What I see is as they put themselves together and combined their efforts, they were putting forth a new world order, their axis, so that they could rule the world together. So, extreme nationalism. So at this time again, we had the Great World Depression, the Great Depression going on, and nations were concerned with solving their own domestic problems, even at the expense of everyone else. So here's a picture of nationalism. They're all following the dictator right off a cliff, So extreme nationalism, where they cared more for their own nation and not for any other nation at all. So. And this led to Italian fascism, German Nazism, and Japanese militarism. All of these isms here have to do with the control of satanic control in some way. The focus on them ruling and them ruling over others. So, international tensions. And then there were widespread religious unbelief. Not so in America. America had revivals of such, but Europe and the European theater, there was mainly the influence of Darwinism and socialism, religious modernism, all these isms there that had nothing to do with the gospel, that had nothing to do with Jesus Christ. And they were very strong in Europe. There was spiritual blindness to the Word of God. Materialism was prevalent. Materialism, everyone there was focused on their economic circumstances. Materialism, nothing spiritual. The people of Russia, Germany, Italy, and Japan became easy prey for dictators who promised a better future. They were looking for someone to save them, not looking to Jesus Christ, but they were looking to someone to save them physically. Isn't that what we do? And they would end up with trusting in dictators that would lead them into horrible places. Let's just say that. So here's a picture. We have Darwin. You know what? I have to say one little thing here. I do believe that Darwin got saved right at the end of his life, and he actually denounced his theory of evolution. But it seems to me how these dictators went all the way with evolution, saying, oh, let's, to the point of bringing evolution to the saying that there was a master race, and eugenics, getting rid of those, peoples that they thought were inferior races, And that's what was going on. Here we have Darwin, we have Hitler. At this point, we have Karl Marx, bringing in socialism and communism. And then we have the Enlightenment movement all in the background saying, oh man, we can enlighten man by other ways, and going away from the pure gospel of Lord Jesus Christ. Rising dictatorships. So communism in Russia was rising. In fact, under Lenin, it had actually engulfed all of Russia. And we have a picture here of Joseph Stalin, who would be the dictator at this time in Russia. Fascism in Italy with Benito Mussolini. Here's a picture of him. And he, too, was looking for a revived Roman Empire of Italy. So he, too, was looking, all of them with a very satanic direction, as I could say, and very satanic visions. So, and then we have, of course, in Germany, we have Adolf Hitler here, and we're going to find out a lot more about him, and being very much the instigator of them all in World War II. Militarism with Japan. The Japanese people actually worshipped their emperor here, with Emperor Hirohito right here, worshiping him as a god, and bringing into that military outlook that would go on with Japan, even into the point of kamikazes and suicide, areas to, in that point of their not having a religion that is based on the Lord Jesus, but a religion that was based on peace, but a military type religion in the samurai warrior type Japanese history. So here we have General Hideki Tojo. So let's talk a little bit more about them, more in depth. Communism in Russia. So Vladimir Lenin first established a total communist dictatorship and a police state in Russia. And this was like the time of World War I going on. Here's a picture of Lenin here. So, and he renamed Russia, was not called Russia anymore, but called the USSR, or the Soviet Union. So he renamed that for the Union of Socialist Soviet Republic, they called for socialism, communism. But after Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin assumed control of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, and running the Soviet Union in 1927. In 1928, Stalin made these 5-year plans to make Russia a modern industrial and military state, which he did. He collectivized agriculture, and doing this, it was very horrible, because he forced all these small private farms into these large collective state farms, and basically killing over 10 million Russian and Ukrainian people, and that died starving, and actually due to starvation, because he took away their livelihood and took away their food. So very much of a monster when you think of Lenin and Stalin both, So over 10 million people died. Actually, it's even on the rate. That's 10 million people probably that were starved. But when you look at their history now, it's probably over 20 million people that were killed during the Bolshevik uprising of communism. And it's kind of weird. It says here, American businessmen and engineers played a key role in growth and development during the 1920s and 1930s of Russia. As during those times, there were some businesses that had gone into Russia thinking, oh, maybe communism is the way, and later on finding out it was a dead end. But especially during the time of Stalin, Stalin used every opportunity he could to find support and money and being able to spread communism too during this time. This is before the Cold War. So communism in Russia. Fascism in Italy. So in Italy, during World War I, finished on the winning side, but it had a huge war debt. Basically, to take care and rebuild Italy would take a lot more than they had. Their war debt was huge. Many Italians blamed their government and resented the outcome of the war. Inflation, unemployment, and other hardships made Italians receptive to a dictator, and this dictator would be Benito Mussolini. So Mussolini marched on Rome and became the prime minister in 1922. He called himself Duce, or leader, and he crushed all the opposition, and he transformed Italy into a totalitarian fascist state by 1925, being the dictator of Italy. He promised to end inflation and end unemployment, but he called for a revived Roman Empire. Doesn't that sound like biblical, Like Satan would want a revived Roman Empire? Yeah. So he was thinking that he would indeed be part of ruling the world, if not himself, so along with Hitler. So fascism. What is fascism? When I say fascism, you think, well, what's that? So it's a form of socialism with extensive control of political, economic, and cultural, religious, and social activities. So basically, again, controlling the country, economics, its culture, its religion. Always, if you look at these fascism and communism and socialism, they always persecute Christians first, don't they? The first they want to get rid of is the Christian, because they're basically founded on satanic principles, right? That's what I can see. So basically they permitted some private enterprise in fascism, but strictly regulate them. Fascism what would also happen with Nazi. So when you look at it, it's another type of socialism, even though the communists and the fascists don't always see eye to eye. They have similar control, let's just say that. Nazism in Germany with Adolf Hitler. So World War I left Germany defeated in total ruins. We know that. They were burdened with a debt of $33 billion to pay. And so Germany struggled and defaulted on her payments in 1923, deciding not to pay. And the Great Depression hit, runaway inflation, wide employment, and the people of Germany were looking for a savior, weren't they? So the German people were eager to believe promises and the prosperity from Adolf Hitler, and he led the Nazi party. So they were looking for someone like him. Little do they know what he would be like. But the German people readily accepted his ideas because of the nature of their educational program since the 1800s. So basically in their education, they had taken God out of the schools, and their education program had been very liberal and had been filled with, based on and filled with evolution. And so because of all this, because of that nature, they readily were accepting the ideas of this dictator. They were taught to be loyal to their government and to act on a collective good, not individual rights, but on the collective good. And so that's where the German people lay. They wanted help from their government. They weren't asking help necessarily from God. So through the years, these ideas destroyed individualism and promoted extreme nationalism. So they were basically not looking as the rights of the individual at all. but on extreme nationalism. And of course, Adolf Hitler would be an extreme nationalist person, the extreme of dictators. When you think of dictators, he's like on the top, right? So the secular philosophies caused the Germans to blindly accept radical ideas and passionately fight for their country. So you wonder how they could all follow Adolf Hitler, knowing some of the things he was doing. But they blindly accepted him and said, oh, we must go this way, without really examining what he was doing. Adolf Hitler organized the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Sounds pretty good. National Socialist German, yep. Workers' Party. This was the Nazi party. It was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It doesn't look like fascism, but that's what it is. So in 1924, Hitler, while he was in prison, he started an insurrection against the government back then. He wrote his autobiography in prison called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Mein Kampf. I'm not really good at speaking German, but Mein Kampf. Maybe that's how it's pronounced. But anyway, My Struggle. And this revealed his life philosophy and his drive for power and his blueprint for the future. He would combine Darwinism, evolution, and socialism, just like Karl Marx did with communism. But he would take Darwinism and say, oh, yes, they're the fittest. Basically, there's a strive for the fittest to survive, the most fit. And he would proclaim Germans would have evolved into this super master race, So, survival of the fittest. He called for the war to eliminate inferior races, especially Jews, and to enslave the rest of the people. Why Jews as inferior? You think, okay, of course he did also thought, of blacks and some other, basically, any handicapped people, even homosexual. He had a whole list of those that needed to be eliminated, but his main focus was on the Jews. That's how you can tell if something's really satanic, because there's no reason really to be focused on anti-Semitism, but Satan is. Why? Because Jesus was a Jew, and Jesus is going to come back and sit on the throne of David in Israel. And Satan wants to get rid of all of the Jews to make this impossible for Jesus. So, when you look at that in that light, it becomes very occultish and satanic, and anti-Semitism is. So, in 1934, Hitler transformed Germany into a totalitarian state. He called himself Der Führer, and his government was the Third Reich Empire. So, what is Nazism then? It's an extreme form of socialism which relies on terrorist aggression and fanatical racism. So we added a couple things there to fascism. It goes on to terrorism. He brought in terror. His main way of manipulating countries and people would be by terror. He's a terrorist. And fanatical racism. So again, he was believing that the German people were the ultimate superior Aryan race, and that the others would have to become either in subjection to them or be destroyed, which he would try to annihilate, especially the Jews. So pretty sad. When I think of Adolf Hitler, just a little side track, and you can think on this, his mother was said to be, grandmother, descendant from Jewish in the midst of, she was a maid and she worked for the Rothschilds, and she ended up becoming pregnant with his grandfather or such. Anyway, so you could trace that back to Jewish heritage. But when you look at it in depth, I mean, you look at even the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds were not really considered Jews. They'd say they were Jews, but they're really not, as far as I'm concerned. As far as history goes, because why else would he want to destroy himself, you know? So that's just saying Hitler's background was very satanic in the Illuminati and such. So no wonder he was so possessed with this controlling the world with becoming the Antichrist, you know. So he was very much an Antichrist figure. So that's Adolf Hitler. Hitler caused fear. So Hitler convinced the German people that an international conspiracy of communist Jews and Western capitalism was out to conquer them. And he used fear and distress and turned Germans against the Jews living alongside of them. Many of them owned profitable businesses. And he accused Jews of greed and selfishness and seized their business. The Nazis controlled all the private business through their regulation then at this time. And the Germans believed in evolution and supported Hitler's racist programs. Oh dear. So he also believed the terminally ill, mentally ill, disabled should all be killed. And that babies should be aborted, especially if they were of inferior races. What he called racial inferior ethnic groups. He called many of them gypsies, Jews, and others, and rounded them up and shipped them on to concentration camps. He also added some Polish and some Czechoslovakian Christians and some Christians on, and he added them to his camps too. And these camps, they were either worked to death or they were murdered. And unfortunately, many people didn't realize the threat of this Nazi aggression until later on, when they were well into this global war. In fact, the British statesman Winston Churchill did actually recognize what was going on, but most countries didn't realize the extent of this. So here's a picture of Hitler's use of eugenics. In 1938, the Nazi popularized eugenics against the Jews, were called Erbkrank, and calling the Jews genetically diseased, and depicted Jews as a people with inferior genes. In 1939, Hitler put into action the euthanasia of disabled children, and physicians were asked to fill out questionnaires for each child, and the questionnaires were used to decide whether the child should be killed or not. Can you believe that? Here's a picture of basically in the midst of the concentration camps and in the slum areas gathering up Israel. And here's a picture of him looking at the Aryan race. You know, so, you know, there's this old protocols of Zion, and it basically looks like what Zion, how they feel about the world and such. It's so anti-Semitic. But when you look at that, it really was Hitler's protocols, the exact protocols of Hitler, the exact protocols of Satan, to destroy the world and to take over the world and all this. And so I look at that, I was reading, like, this is exactly what Hitler did. And you know, to come to find out, I believe Hitler had those protocols, and that's what he went by, you know, and changed them and used it as Zionists so that he could make sure that the persecution of the Jews were put in by that document. So let's stop there, and we'll start on the next video.